in the time that I've been in my role and the time that I've worked closely with my colleagues in honors, the staff and the leadership in honors, I've seen us move from talking about the students. And we used to use language about the best and the brightest students. And that didn't seem like a very good description of who our students are. And what does that say about the students that are in honors? It didn't seem robust enough for who we thought our students were in honors. So we moved from a focus on students to talking about the honors community, the community of the students, and that also didn't seem robust enough given the kind of work that we saw our students do and the kinds of things that, if you will, keep our students up at night and who our campus community is. So we found ourselves talking about community, but expanding that notion from being just primarily about students to being about the community that brings us all together. Those of you who are enrolled at the university and those of you who are citizens of the community who care about the kind of issues that we're about to talk about tonight. Then I saw that this honors group progressed to a place of talking about issues that matter in the world. Big issues, the kind of issues that impact all of us. And we witnessed an honors community then that asked us, invited us all to engage in really complex conversation about issues. And it's not just that we're talking about the issues, it's the manner in which we're talking about these issues, the way in which we're talking about these issues. You'll see what I mean by the end of the conversation today. I want to thank my colleagues in honors. I'll say something simple.
You know, when we talk about leadership, there really is a collective leadership that's happening here. You'll see the entire staff working together to serve our students. And it honors me to be next to them and to walk alongside them. And I wanted to hand the microphone over to my colleague, Vicky Lawson, who kind of spearheaded this idea of bringing us all together. Vicky is a scholar. She is a professor of geography. She's a co-founder of the Relational Poverty Network, and she's the director of the honors program. And she will be the first to tell you that she is leading along with her colleagues in the honors program. And at some point, Vicky, I suspect you'll introduce the honors colleagues. And so, you know, it's real. It's a lovely thing for me to come to work each day and know that I have a very close colleague like Vicky. All of my colleagues, my professorial colleagues, they inspire me, and staff colleagues inspire me because I'm around inspiring people. And then every now and then I have the great opportunity to meet people who both inspire me and move me to be different, to walk in the world different, to read different, to think differently. And Professor Vicky Lawson is one of those such people. So I'm grateful to you for your leadership, and I'm grateful for you for your colleagueship, Vicky.
Wow, you all disappeared. Good evening, everybody. We're delighted to welcome you all to Global Challenges tonight. As Ed said, my name is Vicky Lawson, and I work alongside a remarkable team on the honors staff. And I've asked them to just make themselves visible with a wave. You do it too. The honors, and it's on behalf of all of the honors staff that I welcome you here this evening. We're delighted that you're here. And I also want to just take a moment to thank our student helpers, the honors community ambassadors, who help make this night possible. They've been taking such wonderful care of us. So, on behalf of all of us, the speakers and the honors staff, welcome to this event. As we gather tonight, I want to invite you to think, to be curious about the history of our collective presence on Duwamish and Coast Salish people's land. Thinking about rights means learning about our complex histories. And it means thinking about our relations to others. And so that includes being curious about how the university came to be built on land that was not ours. What are the implications of that for us and for the Duwamish and Coast Salish peoples right up until today? While Indigenous land questions aren't the central focus of our work tonight, of course they are central questions of rights that have important historical resonances. And so as we start the event and think about rights together, I want to invite all of us to be responsible and accountable to the histories of the places where we live. So our topic tonight, the question of rights, we thought we'd keep it narrow, is a question most important for you to know, is identified by our students. So every fall, we survey the freshman class as they come onto campus, and we literally ask them, what are the issues that keep you up at night? And every student here who's been through that process can recognize that they've all been part of building these events. So in previous years, students have identified, and they continue to identify, questions like climate change, around poverty and inequality, around access to health care, around the sustainability of our world. And over the years, we've organized events on those topics. But this year, I want to share with you just a taste of what the students identified in addition to those questions. Most of the students this year identified questions around sexual assault, around LGBTQ+ and gender discrimination, how those issues are treated both in the culture and in the law. Students identified human rights violations, racial inequity and racial justice, and gun violence. And so out of that, we decided to pose the question to our panel of the question of rights broadly, because all of those are in some sense dealing with the question of rights. And so what we did is we went out from the students' inspiration and invited a series of people who I will introduce very thoroughly shortly to speak with you from their research and from their experience working in communities. We're not convening a debate. We're not staging a contest around politically polarized ideas, political identities, political positions that circulate in our country. Rather, what we've done is invite people who work on rights questions to share their research and their experiences with you. So our goal tonight, as our students ask us, is to ask, how should we understand rights in this moment, and how do we move forward constructively? So it's a big question. As we all want to do, we're going to ask you all to think boldly with us, expansively with us. And for students in particular, we want to invite you to think about these issues as you chart whatever path you take through the university and beyond. I'd like to just briefly set the global context for this discussion, and I won't do it justice. But we're convening this question of rights in a very transformative global moment. We have rising numbers of refugees from wars and from climate change who are not being welcomed into North Atlantic states. We're witnessing, or rather not witnessing enough, conflicts in Syria and Yemen that are causing immense human suffering and death. We're living through a moment of dramatic and rising income inequality in many places, and we're living in a time in which we're seeing strident forms of both populism and nationalism in countries such as Italy and Turkey, in the Eurozone, not a country, in the UK, my home, and in the US, also my home. So our students are calling us to consider questions of rights, and we believe strongly that public universities have a responsibility to lead discussions about difficult questions, discussions that are accountable to truth and to diverse views. So, we focus tonight from the perspective of the law, from historical and social analysis, and from public testimonies. We focus on the US, but we think that these questions travel, that they are not specific to the US, even though they will travel in different ways. And we've invited passionate thought leaders to think with us to try to address your questions. And we've asked them to engage in this conversation to inspire you and to move you, and to invite you to make a difference as you move through your education and indeed through your lives. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce to you each of our speakers. And there's a lot I want to say, so forgive me for being a bit stilted about this, but I want to get it said. So Professor Megan Francis is Associate Professor of Political Science at UW. She's a fellow of the Thurgood Marshall Institute. She specializes in the study of American politics, race, and constitutional law. She was born in Seattle, educated at Garfield High School, and then at Rice University for both her BA and her MA, and then her PhD was from Princeton. Her research explores the construction of rights and citizenship, Black political activism, and the post-Civil War South. Her work has been featured on MSNBC, BBC, Al Jazeera, NPR, Democracy Now!, PBS, Newsweek, The Washington Post, Seattle Times, and TEDx Talks. You have a treat coming. Professor Francis is also the author of a prize-winning book, Civil Rights and the Making of the American State, which explores how state-sanctioned racial violence shaped the modern civil rights movement. She explores the historical context and current barriers to racial equity in the US, drawing connections between Black Lives Matter and other social movements to reimagine what a successful rights movement might look like now. So we're delighted to have Professor Francis with us. Second speaker I'll introduce is Professor Angélica Cházaro. She is Assistant Professor of Law at the University of Washington. She teaches on critical race theory, poverty law, professional responsibility, and courses on immigration law. Professor Cházaro earned her JD from Columbia Law School, where she received the Jane Marks Murphy Prize for Excellence in Clinical Advocacy, which I think has been a hallmark of your work. Before attending Columbia, Professor Cházaro earned a BA in Women, Gender, and Sexuality Studies from Harvard. Following law school, Professor Cházaro received a Ford Foundation Fellowship to work with the Northwest Immigrants' Rights Project in Seattle. She worked there for 7 years and represented survivors of violence and provided legal services to farm workers. She also served as chief negotiator during the 56-day hunger strike at the Northwest Detention Center in 2014, representing detained immigrants. She's co-founder of the Northwest Detention Center Resistance and a member of Mi Gente, a new national hub for Latinx organizing. She's been interviewed in national and international news outlets for her work. And during the Obama administration, she was a member of the Blue Ribbon Commission convened by the National Day Laborers Organizing Network to advise the executive branch on administrative relief for undocumented people. Professor Cházaro also engages in frontline legal defense of immigrant leaders in our community who've been summoned for deportation. Tom Ikeda is our third speaker tonight. He is founding director of Densho, the Japanese-American Legacy Project, and also a double degree earner from the UW with a BS in chemical engineering, a BA in chemistry, and an MBA. Prior to establishing Densho, Mr. Ikeda managed the multimedia publishing group at Microsoft, engineered artificial kidneys at the Dow Corporation, and worked as a financial analyst at Weyerhaeuser. He has received the Humanities Washington Award, the National JACL Japanese American of the Biennium Award for Education, and the Microsoft Alumni Fellows Award. Since its founding 22 years ago, Densho has published over 900 video testimonies and over 100,000 historical photos and documents about the World War II experiences of Japanese Americans. Densho humanizes a time in our history that many Americans either have or would prefer to forget. Densho educates us about how a president and Congress came to authorize the removal and incarceration of over 110,000 people based solely on race. I'm going to quote Mr. Ikeda about why these testimonies that he has collected matter today. And I quote, "As we grapple with the contemporary controversies surrounding immigration, terrorism, and the infringement of civil liberties in the name of public safety, parallels between the past and present abound. Understanding the story of World War II incarceration and the decades of racial discrimination and government surveillance against Japanese Americans that preceded it offers us opportunities for difficult and thought-provoking conversation, which is precisely what we're about to do tonight." So I welcome all of you. Thank you so much for being willing to speak with us tonight. I'm going to invite each of our speakers to make a brief set of opening remarks to set the stage for their comments tonight. And did we decide on an order? Yes, Tom's going to go first.
Thank you, Vicky. And good evening to all of you for coming. You know, when Vicky was reading my bio, I recognized it sounded pretty, technology and science focused. Chemistry, chemical engineering. Over 40 years ago, I was actually an honors student at the University of Washington, pre-med. But now, I think of myself as a public historian. And what's a public historian? In my mind, it's just really a fancy name for someone who gets to go out in the community and listen to stories. And so for my introductory remarks, I'm going to tell a story. I'm actually going to tell a story about my family, its history, and through that, weave in some of the issues about rights that I think affect especially communities of color and other vulnerable communities in our country today. And so if you could you put the photograph I brought? So this is a photograph of my grandparents. And the reason I chose this one for tonight, a few days ago was Veterans Day. And every Veterans Day, my mind sort of wanders to the story of a young man, my uncle, who was a University of Washington student during World War II, who volunteered for the U.S. Army and then was killed in action while fighting in Italy. And the story that I never knew him, but I tried to piece it together through stories of family relatives, friends, and photographs. But while I did that, I really started developing and seeing the story of my grandparents, and that's the story I'm going to talk about in terms of the rights. The gentleman in the middle is my grandfather. He came to Seattle. He immigrated in 1908, and this was the year that there was a ban instituted, a treaty between the United States and Japan to halt the immigration of Japanese workers. And so if my uncle or if my grandfather had tried to come to Seattle just a few months later, he would not have been allowed to come into the country. But he wanted to live in Seattle. He wanted to stay here and raise a family. So about 10 years later, he returned to Japan. He married my grandmother, the woman on the left holding the flag, and came back to Seattle to start a life. And that was just shortly before another immigration ban. So in 1924, there was a complete ban on immigration. So when we think about rights, who gets to come through borders and who gets to stay is very much part of rights. They started a family. They had 6 children. But being an Asian immigrant was difficult before the war. One, if you were an Asian immigrant, you could not become a citizen. You could not become a naturalized citizen. And so they were unable to become a citizen. And because of that, they instituted laws called alien land laws that, these were sort of racist laws that stated if you were ineligible to become a citizen, you were also ineligible to own property. So again, another right. Who gets to own property in our country? We know that during World War II, the Japanese Imperial Navy attacked Pearl Harbor, and the United States entered the war. When that happened, my uncle was a student at the University of Washington. He was actually an ROTC student here. And after that happened, he actually tried to volunteer for the Army. But what was told to him, the Army said that Japanese Americans, my uncle, who was a U.S. citizen by birthright, wasn't eligible because they classified him as an enemy alien. So even this concept of who's a citizen was being questioned. Shortly after, he, my grandparents, and his 5 siblings were rounded up and brought to the 1st of Puyallup Assembly Center and then to the Minidoka concentration camp. And although my uncle, my mom, my other uncles and aunts were all U.S. citizens, they were denied the right to due process. So there were no hearings and no trials for them as they were placed into these camps. From there, my uncle was eventually able to volunteer. So this was early 1943 that he volunteered for the Army, finally, that the Army let him do that. But what's ironic is, at the same moment that he was volunteering, there was a movement to actually strip the citizenship of all of the Niseis. These were the Japanese Americans who were, again, U.S. citizens by birthright, but the claim was if their parents couldn't become citizens, they shouldn't be citizens. And even though they were born in the United States, let's strip those away from them. And so this went through the federal courts, fortunately because of the 14th Amendment, the birthright clause, that their citizenship was retained. My uncle joined the Army, fought in Europe, and this photograph was taken 18 months after he volunteered. I just mentioned this story briefly because I want to give you a context of who I am and what I sort of bring when I think about rights, and in particular when I think about sort of the gaps that what's clear to me is that when we talk about rights, rights aren't this absolute that everyone gets. Certain rights happen and certain people get certain rights, but it's not a universal thing, and that's something that I hope to bring during this conversation tonight. Thank you.
Greetings, everyone. Good evening. First, I just want to express my deep appreciation to Professor Lawson and all the other honors, instructors, professors, students, for putting this amazing event together and for everybody for spending this evening with us today and to be engaged in this topic. I'm very excited. So what I want to do with my few opening minutes is to say a little bit about who I am and what I believe in and why I think it's so important for us to talk about rights, the possibilities of as well as the limitations of. So some students already know this. I am, as Professor Lawson said, was born and raised in Seattle, K through 12 public schools. I then went to college with the hopes of pursuing a degree in computer science. That only lasted a semester. It didn't last long. I became interested in the struggles of oppressed peoples. I made the mistake, or perhaps I had the good fortune, of taking a history class in Caribbean nation building. I was interested in how people at the margins of different societies fight for freedom. And so that's actually what animated the rest of my time at Rice University, where I pursued my undergraduate degree. I decided to pursue a degree in political science and economics, in part because I had a deep desire to understand political and economic inequality that was surrounded my life here in Seattle, and that surrounded so many of my people in Houston, Texas at the time. I went away, I was abroad, and 9/11 happened in my second year in undergrad, and I returned to a very different country, or perhaps it was always the same country. There were so many tragedies that happened in terms of the numbers of lives that were lost, the fake WMD quest, and then a war, as well as, and for me, which hit me most acutely, was a number of Muslim and Arab friends I had who were treated differently once I came back home. At the same time, I had also was volunteering at a prison outside of Houston. Some people may know this. Texas is considered prison empire, Texas tough in the United States, in part because Texas has the most number of incarcerated individuals in the United States are incarcerated in Texas. I decided to pursue the questions around criminal justice, political and economic inequality, and animated my time in undergrad into graduate school. So into graduate school, what I decided to do, I thought that a degree in political science would help me understand the political system. It didn't really. I actually ended up focusing on a different story, and so that's what I want to spend maybe 2 minutes on right now. So I became interested in understanding the political system through understanding people. And by people, I'm talking about Black political actors in the beginning of the 20th century. So one of the things that I often tell my students is, how do we understand civil rights? And often what they point to understand civil rights are the important issues such as housing segregation, voting, and of course, education. Education, I think, in this day and age, is foundational to the way in which we understand civil rights. So I was pushed back, and it's this kind of this nice, tight timeline that exists from 1954 until about 1964, 1965, right? And so I tell my students that we need to push back this timeline into the 19th century, and very much we need to think about the beginning part of the 20th century. And so they're always like, well, what are you talking about? And so I describe, my studies actually set me focus on the NAACP, which is the organization that we now know brought us Brown v. Board. But the NAACP began focused on, not on this question around education, desegregation, but really focused on the question around racial violence, lynchings, and mob violence. And this is when they started in 1909. They really truly believe that to live a life and to have rights and to be treated as equal citizens in this country meant to have freedom from mob violence and lynchings. For the NAACP at the time, the first civil right was this type of freedom from violence. If Black Lives Matter, and this was not the exact words they used, but in some ways they did, then other things would matter. But education, voting, housing segregation meant very little if state violence and individual violence could be enacted on Black bodies, right? And so one of the things that's been interesting to me now, I document this in my first book, I document the NAACP trying to understand what might a country look like that actually does respect one's civil rights. And today we think about it, and the way in which I think sometimes we talk about even on this panel is around legal rights. For the NAACP, it wasn't a foregone conclusion that they should pursue the law. Today, there's obviously NAACP Legal Defense Fund, and so many of the ways in which we think about the fight for rights revolves around the law. But I often pose as well, and I've spent a long time trying to understand, how did different groups, especially Black citizens, fight for rights at the beginning of the 20th century before this government actually guaranteed their rights, right? So post-54, we now know civil rights. But before then, the NAACP is not even talking about civil rights. And what they're trying to do is to change public opinion. They're trying to change, get legislation passed in Congress. They're trying to appeal to, I know this is crazy, Woodrow Wilson and Warren G. Harding. And the idea here is that if we can humanize ourselves, then these presidents make a statement, then something will change. For the NAACP in the first 2 decades of the 20th century, the law was their last resort. And so one of the things that I often think about today, and still in this long fight for Black lives still to matter in this country, about what other avenues might we pursue besides the law and or with the law. Thanks.
Hi all, thank you so much for being here, for spending your time with us tonight. It's really an honor to have been asked to be part of this, so thank you all. So I trained as an immigration lawyer. I practiced immigration law for a place called the Northwest Immigrant Rights Project for 7 years. I spent a childhood living on the U.S.-Mexico border, mostly without lawful status, so I had that experience of being part of a family that didn't have, technically, the rights that U.S. citizens have, or even residents or people with lawful status. And so I come to the critique I'm going to talk about now, these 3 provocations, with a heavy heart, because I think I grew up sort of hoping and believing in the United Nations, or the idea of human rights, or the idea of legal rights as I came to study them in law school, hoping that they would provide an answer to some of the injustices that I had seen growing up. And what I want to talk about today is some of the limits, at least to the legal rights framework that I've come to. So part of what I teach and study is critical race theory, and critical race theory informs a lot of my work on immigration law and policy and the advocacy and organizing I do locally and nationally. And so I want to talk about these 3 dangers that I see of demanding rights or legal rights, and having that be our framework. The first is that I think that rights demands often ask the wrong questions. I think that rights demands can hide the way that the law actually works in practice, and finally that rights demands can stunt our imaginations. And so to talk about these, I'm just going to give you a quick example. I'm sure you all have seen images or read about or heard about the migrants making their way to the U.S.-Mexico border. We saw images this past summer of migrants making it to the border with their children and being separated and incarcerated separately. And now we're seeing this organized caravans of migrants coming up, again, from 3 countries in Central America, the northern triangle countries of Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras, to ask basically fleeing for their lives and coming to the U.S.-Mexico border. And so, obviously, the right, Trump used its caravan during the midterm election cycle to try to sort of drum up anti-immigrant hatred and drive people to the polls. And it's debatable how much it worked, but that was very much what we were seeing. More recently, this past week after the midterm elections, the president actually announced that he's going to stop allowing people who arrive to the U.S.-Mexico border anywhere other than through the lawful ways, and he's going to stop allowing them to apply for asylum. And so, that was a huge thing in terms of immigration law. And when I see all of this is sort of as a dress rehearsal, Vicky talked about what are the challenges we're facing right now. The migrant caravan, which is maybe 2,000, 3,000 people, is nothing compared to, I think, the massive climate-based displacements that we're going to be seeing in the coming years and that we're already seeing. And so the way that the U.S. is treating these folks right now, I think, is basically a rehearsal for what's going to come, and which to me makes this so much more urgent. And so when we're looking at what the answer has been from liberals or progressives to what's happening right now, or the threat of what's happening at the border, it has been to protect the rights of the people arriving to apply for asylum. And so U.S. law and international law offers, it's very clear that people get to apply for asylum no matter how they got into the U.S. And so, lawyers, the ACLU are asking for that right to be enforced. And then another simultaneous fight has been for the fight for the right for people to have an attorney when they make that claim, because without an attorney, it's very difficult to bring a successful asylum case. So what's the problem that I see now with this response that relies on these two rights? So going back to my first question is that I think rights are asking the wrong question. When we talk about the migrant caravan in the context of the right to apply for asylum or the right to an attorney, we focus our outrage and our advocacy on those 2 points. What do we end up missing? I argue that we are not talking about the U.S.'s role in displacing people from Central America. It allows us to escape talking about which immigrants get detained and deported and which don't in this country. We don't end up talking about the racialized exercise of the deportation power. And we're not talking about why detention and deportation are the U.S.'s primary response to people fleeing their lives to begin with. And we're definitely not talking about how in the past 5 years, 80% of the asylum requests for people in those 3 countries that are coming now have been denied, even when people have the right to apply for asylum, and how those numbers are just getting worse under Trump. So even if everyone had the right to apply for asylum and an attorney to help them with their case, most of them would still end up deported. So a focus on rights would encourage us to see that as a fair outcome as long as somebody had an attorney. So we see how deportation and rights can actually go hand in hand. I'm worried that this focus on rights is distracting our critical gaze at a time that we need that gaze more than ever. I'm also worried, and I can say this now from the law school, that rights really hide the way that the law actually works. Because if we end up granting every person crossing the border the chance to apply for asylum, and even providing with an attorney at government expense, the reality is, and I can tell you this from doing this work on the ground, is that most of them will still be deported. So whose rights are being protected in this scenario? I'd argue that the institution that rights protects is the U.S. state itself. Rights grant the state a legitimacy that I don't think at this point it deserves, at least not in terms of its relationship to immigrants, to poor people, to Black communities. Because it turns out that protecting immigrant rights is different from protecting immigrants themselves. Protecting immigrant rights, including the right to apply for asylum, or the right to an attorney, the right to due process, does not mean that you get to avoid deportation. But protecting immigrants would mean precisely that, ending detention, ending deportation. The people who are coming to the U.S. border right now are not interested in a fair process that guarantees their legal rights. They're interested in saving their lives and the lives of their children. And I'm concerned that a rights discourse, especially one focused on legal rights, doesn't get us there. So finally, this leads to my third provocation, or my third challenge for rights, which is that our legal rights discourse ends up stunting our imagination. What if what we're trying to protect is people instead of rights? What would that look like? What would it take? What if we went beyond a paradigm of protection, even of asylum seekers, to one of solidarity, or even allegiance to the migrants headed here right now, rather than allegiance to rights? What demands might we make then? When we stick to the conversation of rights, we often don't end up getting to these points. And so that's part of the conversation I'm hoping we can have tonight.
I suspect you can all see why I'm so excited to have these three people with you tonight. So I'm going to pose a few questions as moderator, but I want you to know that the questions that I'm posing come from you. We received a lot of wonderful questions from the RSVPs, and we've curated those into very difficult, broad questions, but nonetheless intended as a provocation for the conversation. I would also want to say right now that as you're listening and thinking and engaging, think of your own question, because in the second part of the program we have an open mic, and we are going to invite people to come up and pose a question that's been inspired by our conversation. So as much as you can in a room of 500 people, we want this to be a dialogue and a conversation. So try to think in those terms as we talk. So the first little cluster of questions is a wonderful segue from what you talked about, Professor Cházaro. You all ask questions about how people are engaging rights as a framework, or how you work with something different than rights. And you started to go in that direction at the end of your comments around, instead of rights are so often framed not only as legal but as individual. And you raised the question of thinking about collectivities as a different way to frame. So for each of you, and please in conversation with each other, what are the potentials and limits of rights, and limits of rights as a remedy for forms of injustice? And what other frameworks do you think with? Please jump in.
Okay, all right. I'm going to go ahead. So I'd like to think that I engage in some type of Black freedom dreaming. In part, I have been very interested in how African Americans in this beginning part of the 20th century, leading up to today, how do they construct a way out of extreme forms of state and individual violence? How are they strategizing about that? How are they organizing around that? Specifically for the NAACP, in the first quarter of the 20th century, rights was a tool, right? Rights discourse, rights language at the time was a tool when appeals to public opinion didn't work, when organizing around legislation didn't work, when appeals to significant and important presidents also did not relieve the amount of violence that consumed their lives. For them, it was this idea, let's appeal, let's make a legal case around the 14th Amendment in terms of equal protection of the laws, and perhaps somebody will hear this, right? And so, but I think also what's constraining about that, though, right, is that for many people, what that did, especially in terms of the NAACP, not all Black activists at this time, but especially for the NAACP, it locked them into a type of way in which they contested violence and rights in this country and became a kind of this legal-based way, right? And so one of the concerns is that up through the 50s, 60s, and still to today, that a lot of the claims they make against in terms of what is going on around denials of citizenship freedom are very much in the frame and in the discourse of rights that are not as rightfully so many Black Lives Matter activists are arguing it should be demands around liberation and freedom. It should also perhaps be with rights as well, but that should not be fully what and how we talk about rights.
Yeah, so when I thought about this, I actually went back to some of my sort of process engineering. I mean, it sounds kind of weird, but when I think of the rights, and in particular when I look historically, the gaps in terms of who gets certain rights, it was always an interesting sort of exercise to not only look at that and to realize that there were differences between different groups in terms of what rights they had. But then, in some ways, thinking, how did that happen? Moving back in terms of a framework, in terms of what were the root causes that got us, the racism, the white supremacy, all those things where it was interesting as a public historian, when you start thinking like that, the questions you started asking were different. You started getting more in terms of what were the thoughts in terms of your values, your your fears, the things that cause certain things was interesting. And so when I think about, for instance, and we started actually getting really alarmed about 3 years ago, because when we studied the Japanese American experience during World War II, we saw the root causes were fear and racism, and it just didn't appear. I mean, it happened like decades before. We looked at this. We heard the stories of Japanese Americans not being able to go to certain places, and what people were saying about them. And 3 years ago, when the candidate Trump started running, and we started hearing the rhetoric, it was almost exactly what we saw. That was almost a prelude to the incarceration of Japanese Americans. And so those are the kind of things that we started looking at, because obviously it's really easy to sometimes see the gaps in rights. And then what's also interesting is to see these themes and these patterns that happen over and over again, and to really start addressing those. And it's really addressing the racism, the oppression that we have, and realize we have to do that first, because we realize that to address the rights during the Japanese American, we use the legal system, but we needed all this other work to happen before we actually made progress.
Yeah, and picking up on what Megan was saying about how we have been locked into how rights are being contested, I think about the ways in which rights have become an end in and of themselves rather than a tool. I think that so many different movements have sort of used them for historically, and have that switch to having rights be the end all and be all, and the end in and of itself loses the possibilities that we actually need, loses the imagination that we actually need. And so different frameworks I think about are in part the harm reduction framework. So I think a lot about all the immigration reform that keeps getting put forward that says, well, the problem with immigration is that we have 11 million people here without status and they have no rights. So if we get as many of them status as possible, then things will be fixed. But that doesn't, mostly every single time that kind of reform comes out, it's not just that we're going to give status to some people. My question for me is, what happens to all of those who don't qualify? Because every time we see a piece of immigration reform, that piece of reform also expands the ways in which some people who don't qualify are deportable. So it splits people into the deserving and undeserving, deserving of rights and undeserving of rights, and those undeserving of rights, it's okay then to expand deportation. It's okay to expand border enforcement against that group. So what if instead we asked, does this intervention increase or decrease harm for those who are left out of the protection of rights, and made our interventions in policy or in legal work through that lens? And what if, for the stuff that we're actually trying to shift, we thought, how can we reduce the harm of living without lawful status? How can we reduce the harm of living with a criminal conviction? How can we reduce the harm of being Muslim American in this country at this moment? And thought about what interventions could shift that, and made that sort of our framework. I think that could sort of shift the way we think. And to me, that gets to, that was very much the way I was thinking, especially during the Obama era. But in this moment, particularly after this past summer, it was very surprising to me to see for the first time this framework, and this push to abolish ICE being lifted up for the first time. And I think it's not a coincidence that it's happened at the time when things are so dire for immigrant communities that people can no longer count on the promise of liberal immigration reform to save them. They're saying, well, actually, don't reform ICE. We don't want a gentler, kinder ICE that protects our due process rights when they deport us. We want ICE gone altogether. And so I think that framework of abolition we're starting to see in different places outside of just the criminal reform sphere because of how dire things have gotten.
So I remember, Tom, when we first started to talk about Densho, you talked about rights in other frames. You talked about them in terms of culture and imagination and alternative ways of understanding what might ever be possible. And as I'm listening to each of you talk, you're actually talking about rights as a cultural project as much as a political and legal project. If you would like to say it, but I know I haven't scripted, but I think reflecting on the ways in which rights are being framed in the culture allows us to think beyond them in a certain way. I don't have to put you on the spot. me that we're talking about narratives about who communities are and about who are rights-bearing people, and that those are more than legal arguments, that they are clearly rights meant nothing in the context of incarceration. And so I'm fascinated by the ways in which you have shared that the stories that you've heard from your respondents are about thinking of rights more broadly and thinking of them in terms of culture, identity, and value as much as they are about a legal claim to rights.
Yeah, yes, I think I'm thinking back to our conversation and how when you first had this conversation about rights and how in many ways I had to think about it in different ways. Previously, when I think about the stories and what happened, it was more about just the personal lives of individuals and what they went through, and sometimes the legal issues. I mean, there were the landmark court cases and all of those things that we talk about in the academic world or the legal world in terms of what we're supposed to be protected. But in the end, they all failed, and the community had to grapple with these things on their own. I mean, different systems came in place in terms of support. In some ways, when I think about the stories that we collect, in some ways, it's a response to the trauma that happened to this community. It was a way for the community to talk about their trauma so that they could heal. And sometimes I feel like we lose sight of that, the humanness of when people go through these experiences to just let them share those things.
Which speaks to the limits of rights as a remedy, and legal rights as a remedy.
Yeah, and when you say thinking about individual lives versus the cases that we hear about, for me there was a moment when I shifted from practicing full time to being able to teach and therefore have more time to support community organizing efforts. And I was going into the detention center and people were talking to me in a different way when I wasn't their attorney. So when I was during the first contract at the Northwest Detention Center in 2014, I would go in and the people who were on hunger strike who I was talking to would tell me all about the conditions of detention, tell me what was happening with their families, tell me why they started starving themselves to try to get the attention of ICE. And they would tell me things, and some of them had lawyers. One of them I remember telling me, I have epilepsy and I had an epileptic seizure on the way to the detention center. I was never treated and I was still having terrible health issues because of that. And I said, oh my God, have you told your lawyer, your immigration lawyer? And they said, oh no, why would I tell her about that? She's just working on my legal case. And so, so even the way that people discipline themselves into asking certain things of the law, and yet they had come to a moment where they were so sick of what was happening in that center that they had all come together as a collective and begun refusing to eat, and so they were asking for different things, and that allowed them to ask for different things that were outside of the framework of the law. They were all asking to be released. They were asking for deportations to stop. They were asking to stop being taken advantage of in ways that the law didn't even recognize, but that, really drawing their individual stories outside of the framework of what the law allowed. I felt like there were a lot of different possibilities of what their demands could even be.
Yeah, so that reminds me of some people who, clearly, they think back and they know their rights were taken away. But by them just being able to share a story and having someone listen to it, that transformed them as much as an apology from the government. Just the fact that someone else heard their story and honored it, I think was really important to people in our community.
So I'm going to move us to the second cluster of questions. Remember, these are all from the audience. And this one, I think, probably was anticipating the election that we just had, in a sense. There are a set of questions from you all about the relationships between governmental power, US democratic practices, the judicial system, and rights. Let me give you an example of a kind of question, and please feel free to take this wherever. But one example would be, does our legal system prevent marginalized people from attaining full and equal rights? So reversing the typical logic, right? Or what alternative forms of rights claims are being enacted right now? So feel free to take that wherever you desire.
Oh,
There's a lot, right? I'm so excited for especially this prompt and what we're going to talk about here. I'm going to try to get this started and say two. One, I think, I know I've spoken about it already today, but I think the Black Lives Matter movement, all of its different varieties, and all of the many different organizations that are a part of it, provide a way to reimagine what citizenship, what freedom, and what liberation, what does it mean to be somebody who lives in this country and be treated as a human with dignity. I think that they try to push against this type of traditional rights framework that goes to Congress and that fights through court cases. To think about it so much more holistically. And one of the things that I think really resonates with me is the divestment and reinvestment campaigns. And so how do we divest from things that are hurting specifically communities of color, and how do we reinvest that in things that actually bring health and or more joyful. The other thing that I've been really interested in is especially in the post-9/11 era, the way in which Muslim and Arab communities have organized, especially have made claims, and I'm thinking specifically in the tri-state area, but all over the country, around bigger claims and calls for community control of their neighborhoods, and in part because, especially if you think about the tri-state in the Northeast, on the East Coast, the way in which so many Muslims and Arabs are stopped and frisked, the ways in which communities are under heightened suspicion and also surveillance. And they have, I think, through so many of the kind of organizing their efforts, so much of it through organizing on the ground, have made to question things that so many people don't question. So, for example, one of the things I raised in my upper division law classes is the so-called no-fly list, which we think keeps us safe, right? But what is also being used very actively by the federal government to coerce individuals into being informants. And this is an act, there's many, many cases and many examples of this in terms of if I am somebody who goes to a specific mosque and I want, and let's say on Helica, she is not, but an FBI agent, she wants me to inform on this mosque, she would approach me, and if I refuse, she would then likely threaten me to be put on a no-fly list. And if I continue to refuse, I likely would be. And this happens again and again in so many communities, right? And so how can we think about organizing around something that seemingly is legal and that is supported by so many people, right? And so I've been really interested in how different communities who are very much impacted by what we think is legal and right are actually trying to change that discourse.
So I want to tell a story around this one, because clearly the legal system did not protect the Japanese Americans. And there was a fairly famous case that came out of the University of Washington. There was a sophomore sociology student, Gordon Kurabayashi, who was a student here. And while he was studying at Suzuki Library one night, and there was an 8 p.m. curfew for Japanese Americans who had to leave or get back to their homes by 8 p.m. And so what he recognized when he was studying with his friends, they were all Caucasian other students, he recognized it wasn't fair. I mean, he was a U.S. citizen, he did nothing wrong, and why should he follow curfew just because of his ancestry? So he made the statement that ancestry is not a crime, and he challenged the government all the way up to the U.S. Supreme Court, where he lost. But I had the opportunity, the privilege of interviewing him when he was alive about 18 years ago. I did about a series of 5 interviews. And there was something that he said that struck me in terms of when the system fails you, when you're so clearly in his mind, and I think later on showed it, that he was so much in the right. How do you deal with that? And Gordon shared with me something he wrote when he was in the King County Jail. He was there for actually about 9 months. And on July 4th, 1942, on Independence Day, he wrote, and this is like a 20-year-old from UW, he wrote, "But even though this is America, these things happening today are not American. They are the results of misinterpretations, misemphasis concerning the right thing to do, hysteria, and short-sightedness. It is up to those of us who feel that a wrong has been committed, that we have fallen short, to bear witness to that fact. It is our obligation to show forth our light in times of darkness. And the thing that struck me about Gordon and his life in dealing with depression was the light that he would bring to these things, because he recognized the system was wrong, the courts and other mechanisms were not protecting them. But in that, he believed that it would be light that would sort of advance the cause, and so that was something that I took from that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I was thinking about Gordon Hirgash is sitting in King County Jail and the role that the jails in King County continue to play today, thinking about the ways in which obviously what he was doing at the time was very unpopular, but yet we look back and say, well, of course it's totally vindicated. And the ways in which like the sort of cutting edge like rights or reimagined rights struggles right now aren't necessarily the popular ones. You know, how we can think that everybody would join in if it was the right thing, but that's not the case. You know, so I think about specifically here in King County, that for the past 6 years the county has been pushing with everything they've got to build a $210 million jail for youth. So they are planning to tear down the old jail and build a new jail. And there's been a group of activists who have been pushing just as hard as the county has for the past 6 years, saying this is the wrong move. You're designing a jail that's designed to incarcerate our youth for the next 50 years, and we know that there are wildly disproportionate rates of black kids and native kids in the jail already, and we know the jail only hurts youth, that there's no such thing as a trauma-informed jail. And this is again where we get in trouble with rights, because the county's saying, no, this is the best jail. The kids are going to have the most rights. They're going to have the best lawyers. They're going to have, it's the best designed jail in the country. It's going to be cutting edge of jails for youth. You know, and that just, to me, it's the limits of how far you can go with saying, you know, this is going to be wonderful because it's within the law, and what you're talking about doesn't yet even exist. The idea of not having a jail for youth. To me, that just points to the importance. Kind of, we push up against those edges where we don't yet have the form that we need, but that doesn't mean we stop asking and only keep asking in the form where we're like, okay, well, can you make it a nicer jail, or can you make more visiting rooms? No, we still have to stick to the imagination of the thing that we actually want, even if the form doesn't yet exist that we can imagine that. Some would say the form already does exist, because there is no jail that is full of wealthy white youth, and so we clearly have ways that people already deal with harm when you harm each other in wealthier white communities. Maybe that's another discussion.
Wonderful. So I think what we'll do in the interest of keeping us moving forward in time is two things. We have a third prompt that I would like to at least put out there on the floor, but while we're starting to talk about that prompt, I'm going to invite you to start making your way to the mic. Do not be shy. We'll have a line of people and we'll take a few questions at a time. I'll come back to the line in just a moment. So don't feel that it's rude to be getting up while we're having the discussion. Feel free to bring your questions to the mic. And while you're sort of gathering your thoughts and getting organized, I'm going to add one more prompt to our speakers. Again, this is a prompt from you all. And it could not be more perfect, in a sense, for the speakers and what they've discussed already. And it's this question: what is the role for memory and history as part of our current struggles around rights? And related to that, who sets the terms for what rights are or can be? So I invite you guys to take a quick stab at this while we organize our...
Yeah, I mean, it's also a follow-on to what we talked about earlier. I mean, I think, as a historian, there's always, it's almost a cliche that, if you forget the past, you're doomed to repeat it, and that's kind of what we talk about. But, I think something else from a history standpoint, or events that have happened that's really important to recognize, and that was, again, that healing process that, for us to move forward as a country, there's a lot of healing, a lot of reconciliations that need to happen, I think especially with communities of color. I think it was important that the United States apologized to Japanese Americans for what happened during World War II, during the 80s. I think that was a very freeing experience for the community. It completed an event for many people in the community that they can then move forward. And my wife is sitting in the front, and I recall there was a woman, an elderly woman in the university district, Martha Nishitani. She had a dance studio, a long time, for decades. And we interviewed her, my wife interviewed her. And again, before she could move forward, she had to tell her story. And I remember when she finished the interview, she was in tears, and we were a little concerned, like, are you okay? And she said, in some ways now she could die. Now she could move forward because such a weight had been lifted. And so much part of history, we talk about what happened, what we learned from it, and that's all important. But also, we need to also complete a lot of the trauma in terms of collecting stories.
No, that's excellent. So one of the things that actually reminded me of something that I wanted to talk about on the previous question, for me, beyond the divestment reinvestment campaigns for the Black Lives Matter movement, one of the things that has very much resonated with me, and I know many other people, is its claims and its call for reparations, right? Reparations for slavery, reparations for other types of violence that has happened since then. And for some people, they're like, what does that look like? Can we trace all these people back? But it also requires us to have an imagination about what those reparations may look like, right? They don't necessarily have to be to individual people. It could be towards communities. I mean, there's so many different ways to think about reparations and acknowledging that something very horrible happened and certain people and or governments are responsible for that. But I think that as a result, because that hasn't happened, a lot of people have not been able to move past that, I think, for good reason. But I do want to address this question here in terms of kind of the role of history. So I read history so I can teach, but also so I don't go crazy, right? Especially in where we are right now in terms of the political climate. I have students, some of which are in this audience, who come into my office and are like, I can't believe what's going on right now. How can you still have hope? How can you teach about these things and be you, which is woman and reads as Black, right? And for me, history is really important and to do a lot of things, but especially for two things. One, to teach me about how long movements take, right? Some people say that, like these different movements did not create change in a year, in 2 years, in 3 years. What? Huh? Like, what movement history have you read, right? And how committed are you to these ideas, right? So like serious movement commitment means that you are in this for a long, long time. So get comfortable. And then second, the other thing that I think is really important here that history reminds me of is the importance of other people. I've always, at some level, disturbed that in so many ways, when we talk about rights, we talk about struggles, that the people who are most wrong are at some level responsible for the repair. Right, the repair of this nation's wrongs falls on those people who are actually most impacted by that wrong. And one of the things that these movements have taught me is that it means that many people who are not involved in, let's say, the youth jail, who haven't been incarcerated, who haven't, right, faced Japanese incarceration, and people who understand who believe in the idea of freedom and citizenship and who have and hold certain ideals, need to join ranks and hold community with people, because otherwise nothing will change.
I should do that. But, I mean, this idea of having a movement, and I think a lot about like, what is our generational charge, and thinking about things in terms of generations. You know, one of the groups I'm most inspired by is a group called Generation 5 that's seeking to end child sexual abuse in 5 generations. So literally, they're like, in 125 years, we think we can finally rid our communities of the scourge of child sexual abuse without using, calling the police or the prisons. But they acknowledge that will actually take 5 generations. So to have that sort of vision and be okay with that, because I think, for me, you know, obviously the great despair of this moment and people's immediate suffering seems to call for an immediate response, and that's right. But we have to be also thinking about, you know, sort of what is our generational charge. And so for me, looking back to history, looking back at movements, looking back at like mass civil disobedience campaigns that aren't necessarily taught, you know, when I teach immigration law, I teach Chinese exclusion in the 1890s. You if my students only read the casebook, all they would learn is that the Supreme Court said Chinese inclusion was okay. They wouldn't learn that the reason those cases even got to the Supreme Court is because there was a mass civil disobedience campaign where every single Chinese person in this country paid $1 into a fund to hire the best constitutional lawyers at the time, and they engaged in a 5-year campaign where they all refused to register when the government was demanding that they register. And so you have to be teaching. But we also have to be teaching with the context of what if people always have to move back, not all just teaching the results.
Thank you. Let us invite questions. I'm going to, in the interest of time, in the hopes of getting all the questions answered, and keep your questions fairly brief if you would. And I think we'll experiment with going one at a time and see how that goes. So please. I can give you this.
Okay. I'm Rachel, and you guys talked about how rights need to shift away from a political lens and more of a cultural lens. And I was wondering how communities that are more vulnerable to creation or lack of policies can kind of have that shift when they're often kept out of policy making.
That's a really good question. You stumped us all. I think when I think about that, I think about things like community budgeting, or people sort of figuring out what is it that they're being left out of. And so, whenever the city is deciding how they're going to be spending their money, or the county is deciding how to be spending their money, there are in fact public meetings, and there are ways for people to intervene at each one of those moments. And so I also think about the ways in which we might be left out of some larger public policy discussions, but we're not left out of the possibility of supporting each other and supporting each other's vulnerability to bad policies. And so, a person who's been fired from their job unlawfully may or may not ever be able to hire a lawyer and bring that case to court, and may or may not win at court. But if they and all of their friends with the Seattle Solidarity Network show up at the boss's house and refuse to leave, then that person might get some back pay and get reinstated. So it's that sort of collective action where you're not being given direct access, thinking creatively and seeing that the courts themselves may never even grant you something, even if you have the chance to have a lawyer, that there are other routes. And so I have to think about that as well.
Yeah, no, just again, I think just to add on to Cougar, I think it very much is, and especially in these ways, for sure, it's about collective action. Because one person can't change anything, and you're right, all across this country, for years and years and years, people who are marginalized are specifically kept out of, whether it's the voting process, the political process, the legal process, right? And the only way in which these, especially if you're trying to get heard by the legal system or by the political system, is to engage in types of disruption. Angélica has not talked about, she has talked about, and has not placed herself in, then no, you don't move in, which she is a part of in terms of the disruption around that. But right, they were usually going to build this youth jail, and it took a group of people who were did not have a lot of political power, but were like, this is what you're not going to do. And so I think one of the things that, again, from history, that has guided me in this is the ways in which communities took control of their neighborhoods, of their spaces, right? I often think about back to Oakland in terms of community patrols, because they did not trust the police to patrol their communities, right? And so can we think about like different forms of community action? I think is really important.
I mean, the only other thing is, and to get at the table too, I mean, we do collective action, but voting is really important, as we realize. I mean, as much as we can to get people at the table making these decisions that align with the community values.
So I'd like to invite another question.
That's loud. Hello. So when we have conversations on a national level about decisions that affect the communities that live here, it seems as though those conversations are usually couched in proper noun virtues or values that we agree upon. So like when Joe Biden or Barack Obama argued for the Affordable Care Act, there was a discussion about human dignity. When Mitt Romney argued to repeal it, there was a question of economic freedom. We have a lot of those like capital virtues, but I don't ever see empathy mentioned as one of them. And I was wondering what your thoughts are as to what we as citizens can do to make empathy more prominent and a first-class citizen of our virtue system.
So something that I think is important is I agree. Empathy is so powerful, and what I have seen, not only in terms of our overall country, in terms of the divisiveness, this almost tribalism that we're seeing, but just even in my work, focusing the last 20 years really on the Japanese American story. Part of the empathy that I found was when you really know your community story, your family story, it may sound strange, but that helped me have empathy for other communities. And what I began to see by going that deep dive into understanding my community and the values of that community, it actually helped me understand some of the values from other communities that are around me, that those values became clear to me. But I first had to really do that deep dive to understand those values of not just myself or my immediate family, but my larger community. And those stories were really important in helping me with that.
Great. Next question.
In discussing like how the U.S. treats immigrants with my peers, something I wish I could articulate better is how this is a personal issue. So could you briefly mention some of the foreseen consequences, both not only as a society, but also for us personally, as individuals that you see resulting from our treatment of immigrants?
So it depends, because the question is like, who's the we? A lot of times in these sorts of questions, but in terms of like the impact that it has on people in the U.S. to be treating immigrants at the border in the way that the U.S. is treating immigrants at the border, I think of it very much as setting up the U.S. For a really wretched future. If this is, again, I said at the beginning, I see this as sort of a trial run. And there is a history of, during the Dust Bowl in the 30s where there was a drought that lasted only 10 years, whereas the droughts to come last decades and decades, where there are actually internal border checkpoints. So California wasn't letting in folks from the next state over, Nevada was shutting their border. This was shutting the borders internally. And so the more that we normalize the treatment of migrants at the border, the more that we normalize sending the military to the border, the more that we normalize this hardening of saying these people survive and these people don't. I think it's just a myth that it's going to always be limited to folks at the border, so it will affect folks internally. And then I think there's just like a dehumanization that happens when you allow other people to be treated in the way that we're treating folks at the border.
One of the things that's also interesting is some people write about this, but how the border has moved. And so the way in which we think about the border is not just kind of U.S. Canada, U.S. Mexico, but right in terms of border crossings that exist in the ways in which people enter the United States on land that is not ours. Well, none of this is, but so right when I, for example, went to Dubai, there was this area in which all of a sudden it's like the United States, right? And so one of the things that's also interesting in this moment here is when we talk about borders, but also I think it's already, it's already happening.
Please invite your question.
Hi, my name is Nathan, and I have a question about when two different rights conflict with each other. As a society, how do we know which right we need to side with?
No, I know. Sorry. This is the tough one, right? So, and this is always the question around this balance test. So, for example, I saw that at 5. So this question is, I face it all the time. So one of the big ways here in all my classes, many college students talk about this, is this question around free speech. And so how do you weigh, for example, the freedom and the right to speak freely, also with the right for people to be safe, right? And also around danger. I know how I do that. How the law does that is sometimes the same and sometimes different. In terms of questions around movements, questions around violence, questions around citizenship, and how do I weigh. So for example, one of the ones we've been talking about, been on stage, is around questions around so-called national security, right? And so what are ways in which that we can restrict one's rights? So for example, I talk a lot about detainee rights, especially in Guantanamo Bay and before Ballroom. right? And so what are ways that we can, let's say, detain somebody without a type of due process of law in a sham court trial, in part because we label them as an enemy combatant, right? The other question that I think is really interesting also is one about if we believe in a true due process in terms of that one has, can the United States kill United citizens abroad, right? If we believe in terms of, and the balance there, right, is about that this person is a terrorist and this person will inflict harm on more Americans, many of which are soldiers. And so then how do we weigh one's right to due process, which is one of these kind of like venerated constitutional rights around this other concern? I'm going to leave it to my co-panelists to take the mic. I'm just going to lay out how complicated it is. I'm trying to buy them time up here. But this is, in both of their work and activism, these are questions that they face. So I did my professorial duties. I was like, Megan's bringing it home. No, I didn't.
Yeah, I was going to do something, in terms of maybe not specifically rights, but, national priorities. You mentioned national security, and during World War II, for national security reasons, that was the reason given to put Japanese Americans in these camps. And what we have to recognize too is sometimes these are canards. I mean, they're false. I mean, the government actually knew. I mean, there were high-level people who knew that there was no military necessity, but they will use those arguments to take away the rights of people. I would liken that also to the more recent Supreme Court ruling on the travel ban against Muslims. So again, that was a military security rationale, I think, which was thinly veiled. I mean, I think it was bigotry in terms of religious bigotry, in terms of what the Supreme Court ruled. And it was interesting because Chief Justice Roberts, actually mentioned the Korematsu and Hirabayashi cases in terms of saying, we recognize those were mistakes because those were done for racist reasons. What he missed was the reason the government actually gave were national security reasons, and they hid behind that, and they're doing the same thing now. So we have to be careful when people actually start saying, well, we have to balance these two. Oftentimes, one of those arguments can be very false.
So in the interest of time, the time always flies. What I'd like to do is invite our last three questioners to pose their three questions, if you would, and then we'll spend a little time with them up here on stage. So if you'll keep them brief, that would be wonderful, but let's get them all in play.
I'm Carmen, and I was wondering how we're in this dialogue, we're talking about individual roles, community roles, and government roles. And I wanted to know what the private companies' roles are in all of this, because in the 21st century, they have a very big global impact, and I feel like there's probably something about that.
Great. And so I'm going to invite the other two questions as well.
Hello, I'm Andrew, and you mentioned freedom of speech a little while ago, so I was sort of wondering just how do we, both as like a country and also as a community, approach people who use freedom of speech as a platform to spread problematic ideas?
Hi there, my name is Trevor. This question is for Professor Cházaro in particular. You mentioned earlier that at the southern border, the immigrants often were feeling that the right to due process wasn't sufficient, and that we have to think outside of the rights-based framework to more of a harm reduction framework. Is there a solution to migrant crisis that exists within the rights-based framework, or is it the situation simply so severe that we need to look beyond that? In other words, are there rights that we could establish that would solve the situation? Or
thank you, so I'll open it to you three to pick whichever question you'd like to speak to.
In terms of the one about the role of corporations, very much they have this role, and oftentimes they're not in the conversation. I think a recent example that just came up for us. I mean, in our archive, we have hundreds of thousands of these photographs, and the technology has reached a point where once you identify who that person is in the photograph, with face recognition technology, you can all of a sudden, this powerful tool of finding other people in your archive that is that same person. So it's a very powerful tool. But that same technology is used, for security reasons. I mean, they have cameras that watch you as you go into airports and other places. I mean, and what, so the privacy issues. The corporations are moving quickly. People like Amazon, Microsoft, and these have huge impacts in terms of what rights we have. And so they very much have to be in that conversation, and they have to be transparent with their decision making and their discussions. And they need to reach out to government, community, and individuals in terms of helping to make those decisions.
Follow up on that, Amazon locally has just been exposed as trying to sell their facial recognition technology to ICE directly, and so it's also a matter of us holding them accountable. So there was a Halloween action just a couple weeks ago at the Amazon headquarters, calling Jeff Bezos to basically stop selling this facial recognition technology, where people showed up with a bunch of Jeff Bezos masks because they figured that was the only face probably safe for their technology. But it was also calling on the Amazon employees themselves to push back, and in fact 350 of them already wrote a letter saying we don't want to be selling this tech, we don't want to build tech that we know is going to be used in these harmful ways. These are not times for neutrality. And so I think that sort of internal fight within companies will become more and more important for us to support.
So I'm going to approach this in a different way. I think also in terms of the question around private companies makes me think a lot about so many private companies, the way in which they are involved in this conversation around rights is through their philanthropies and foundations, right? And so, so much of, in terms of the public sector, because over the many political reasons over the past 4 decades, the government has evolved from so much in terms of spending around the public that philanthropies and foundations have stepped in to fill that need, which that has resulted, though, in a critique here, and a great new book, by the way, it's called Winners Take All, is the role of foundations and philanthropy for driving social change in this country. And so one of the things that, in thinking about private companies, that makes me think about is the role of some people who I think have really great aims, goals, intentions, and some people, and I think a lot of people who don't. And so one of my concerns has been about the role of, especially foundations and philanthropies, and very moneyed individuals in their role of funding different movements and what movements they decide to fund. I think one of the things that people gets a lot of attention in the media is like dark money, and we should be very concerned about in conservative causes. But I think also one of the things that we don't spend enough time thinking about is more funding for leftist progressive causes. And so right now there's millions and millions of dollars behind Black Lives Matter. Does this mean now that for some of them, their silence in terms of their critique of Israel-Palestine politics has now happened? Does this mean now that some of them are turning more towards towards the law to make their claims around rights instead of trying to take individuals outside of the streets and outside of the political process, right? And so in what ways are philanthropies and foundations actually steering the agenda of organizations on the ground, trying to force us to think more expansively about rights?
I'm going to draw the formal part of our evening to a close, although you can hijack our speakers if you wish. I will wrangle you off them at a certain point, but there will be a moment to speak to them. I wanted, before you extend your gratitude to our speakers, I want to just say a few words to you all, and it has to do with really gratitude for you all showing up, particularly those of you who are not students, who've shown up to witness and care about and engage with the issues that our own students are so deeply motivated by. I hope that it gives you as much hope as it gives me when you realize the questions that students themselves want to ask and want us all to think about together. I can't close this event without reminding you that the honors staff as a whole makes this event happen, and she'll hate me for this, but in particular, I want to call out Carrie Christie. But more than anything, and I am going to extend a thank you and admiration to our 3 speakers, but I actually want to just say how much I admire and am grateful for you students. for showing up, for posing the questions, for caring about these complicated and deep issues. And we know that you will carry these through your education and whatever path you're going to take. And you inspire us every day, the reason we get up and go to work. So with that, let me say a deep and heartfelt thank you to our three speakers for sharing their brilliance with us tonight.